Good morning, everyone. This is Crystal, and I will be facilitating our webinar today. We're going to go ahead and get started. We'll have a few more people joining us over the next few minutes, but we'll go ahead and get started on our webinar today that we have decided to call Well Begun is Half Done, and how CPS intake and timely initiation can improve CPS assessments. A little about this webinar. It was developed through funding from the North Carolina Division of Social Services by the Family and Children's Resource Program, which is part of the Jordan Institute for Families here at the UNC Chapel Hill School of Social Work. And I am joined here at the school by several people that I will have introduced themselves shortly. We want to start with talking a little about how and why this webinar topic was decided as something that we should cover and that it was relevant. So in thinking about the work that you all do, intake and initiation they're essential parts of our efforts to protect children. And with a proper foundation, it's easier to do a thorough, effective CPS assessment. Intake is where we begin collecting information and making those initial decisions about child safety. So it's going to be such an integral part of the work that you all do. And the documentation that's started at intake, it continues throughout the family's involvement with the agency. And it can play a critical role in the court process. And intake also lays the groundwork for our success with children and families. And the same is going to be true for the timely initiation of CPS assessments, and having the face-to-face contact with children and their families within the required timeframes, and also completing a safety assessment are going to be additional vital parts to ensuring child safety, permanence, and well-being. And one reason that this webinar we decided now would be a good one to do is looking at the last case reviews that were conducted during our most recent Child and Family Services review. The federal reviewers found that in our state, we were in need of improvement when it came to timeliness of initiating investigation of reports of child maltreatment. And although they found many instances where cases were initiated in a timely manner, it didn't happen often enough. It didn't happen every time. So in reviewing the cases that fell short, reviewers cited the things that were going on were practice issues, including insufficient diligent efforts by the caseworker to initiate within time frame, and then also a delay in assigning or writing screening intake reports. So that's just a little about how this webinar topic came about. Next, when we're thinking of the goals for this webinar, we know there's a lot of really good practice going on in North Carolina across the state, and that most of the time we do get it right. And conducting a proper intake and initiating effectively within timeframes, it's not always easy. And we want to acknowledge that the challenges and give you tools and tips to help you because we understand that it's not an easy task. So we'll hope that this webinar will give you those tools and tips to help you with this parts of the child welfare process, and we're hoping that by the end you'll be able to identify and overcome some common errors that we have come up with, and both whether it be through the CPS intake and making sure that we have a thorough intake, and also we'll cover making sure that we're initiating in a timely manner for the CPS assessment. So a little about the technology we're using today on how to communicate with us. Many of you have already found the chat box and said hello, and I see that many of you have joined us in a group, and that several people from your county are there together. So that's one way that you can communicate with us, is through the chat box. And you'll see that there are two options, either in the bottom left of this box, either to send a message to everyone that's in the room, or you can send a message just to the hosts, which is those of us here at UNC. And this is going to be the primary way that you can communicate with us. You can use this box to send in questions or comments as we're going through our time together today. We're going to try our best to answer all your questions during the event. The box the chat box can sometimes move really fast when you have hundreds of people writing in it. So we have someone here working with us to help capture the questions and help keep us on track to make sure that we can capture all of the questions that you have. A little more about questions. We are monitoring them through the chat box, and we'll answer them as possible throughout the webinar. But we also know that this is just one 90-minute webinar, and we have over 500 people attending. So it may not be possible for us to get to all of the questions today. We'll do our best. To make sure that we do get the answers to your questions to you, there will also be a follow-up document that answers questions that are asked during the webinar, and that document will be emailed to all registered participants and posted with the webinar recording. So even if you're participating in a group, as long as you registered, it will be emailed to you. And the webinar recording will also be available on NCSW Learn and on the Family and Children's Resource Program webpage so that you can access that. Another way to get our attention today is using the icons that you'll see in the drop-down box towards the top of your screen in the middle. So there's the raise hand function. Just to give a little practice for this, for those of you that are participating in a group, if you could raise your hand using that icon in the top of your screen. And this is going to help us know how much time to give you people to think through and discuss. All right, sorry for the delay. We are switching computers here. We've had some technical issues come up, but luckily we planned for that and had a backup computer ready. So I see quite a few raised hands, many people participating in a group here. I want to give you a little snapshot of who we have registered for the event. We have more than 570 people registered. This includes 370 child welfare workers with direct client contact. We have 6 agency directors, 122 supervisors, 30 program managers or program administrators, and then we also have 12 county DSS trainer or staff development professionals here with us today. So thank you all for being here. There are some names that I recognize from our attendee list. So I want to welcome you all to the webinar, and we'll start with telling you who all we have here for presenters. So I'll start with allowing Linda to introduce herself, and then we'll hear from the rest of the presenters on their introductions.
Hello everyone, my name is Linda Clements. I'm a policy consultant with the Division of Social Services. I'm located in the Raleigh-Dix office. I've been with the division just since last July. Prior to that, I worked in a large county where I was a social worker for many years before I became a blended team supervisor for 12 years. And I'm happy to be with you today.
Hi, I'm Nikki Hall. I'm the Program Manager for Surry County Department of Social Services. I've been with the agency since 2002. I've had several roles with the agency, but I've spent several years there as their primary intake worker, and we're excited to share anything that we can bring to help improve on any agency's practice, including our own.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristy Preston, and I'm the Director for Surry County DSS. I've been with Social Services for 23 years. Altogether, I've got about 15 years experience with Child Protective Services, both as a line worker and a supervisor. And I can tell you from my experience as a line worker, I understand the importance that we need to place on a good, solid intake. So I'm excited to be a part of our conversation today.
And good morning, everyone. I'm Peter West. I'm a member of the program monitoring team with the division. I'm actually home-based, and prior to joining the division 2 years ago, I spent many years in the county starting in 1997, did line work through CPS in-home as well as CPS Assessments. Spent the last 5 years before I came to the division as a supervisor of a blended team with assessments, in-home, and foster care. And looking forward to sharing with everybody this morning. Thanks.
And thank you again to all of our presenters for being here today. Once again, my name is Crystal Coble, and I am with the Jordan Institute for Families here at the UNC School of Social Work. So a little about the information that we're going to cover today and how it's broken down. So we'll start with talking about the CPS intake and covering information gathering and also screening. And then we'll move into timely initiation and making sure that we are initiating within timeframes. And we'll talk about the face-to-face interview and the safety assessment. And then we'll have a section on practice implications and looking at some of those common errors that we talked about and how to avoid them. And then we're hoping to answer some of the questions that you all may have from our webinar today. So the first thing, we're going to transition over to Linda, who is going to start us on CPS intake and some of the policy around that.
Hello again, everybody. I just want to start off with CPS intake. It is the first stage of the child welfare process, and it sets the foundation for all the following steps. Each report received by intake must be evaluated to determine the perceived risk to a child's safety, the urgency of the situation, and the priority of the report. Intake determines if the report meets statutory definitions and sets the timeframes for initiation. Careful, detailed, and thorough work in intake lays a foundation for well-informed decisions throughout the child welfare process. The quality and consistency of information gathered at this stage directly impacts safety of children and any subsequent interventions. When gathering information regarding the family, comments to the reporter about a family, neighborhood, house, yard, anything may be invaluable for safety and for cases when for example, when the address may be incorrect, maybe just one digit is off. Any notes about the house really can make a difference when that assessor's out there trying to locate a family for initiation. If it is known at intake that any child is not at the home, away, maybe at camp, visiting a relative, that is also vital information that needs to be documented, as the assessment worker may need to request an assist from another county or make contact with the child so that they can make contact with the child within time frame. Also, obtaining information about the relationship between the reporter and the family can help assessment of any possible motives of the reporter and or provide insight regarding an increased level of sensitivity that an extended family member may have regarding the family issue. It's crucial that the intake social worker use interviewing skills to gather information. The intake interview is a kind of professional interview. The intake social worker should use different types of questions depending on what is reported, including scaling and exception questions to gather information as appropriate. These questions provide important information that support improved decision-making regarding screening, as well as gathering information for the assessment. The more information gathered, the better the quality of the initiation. Intake interviews require strong listening skills. Intake social workers usually do not have the option to observe body cues or facial expressions, so they really must use their listening skills to pick up on reporters' use of voice and selection of words, especially descriptive words, and then ask following questions. For example, it can be a very different circumstance when a parent is alleged to have whooped their child, and it may be in response to fear that a young child almost ran into traffic versus an incident with a parent that's very upset with a middle school child who said something they didn't approve of. All this information gathered in intake should be documented and used when using the screening tools. All information gained during intake provides valuable insight needed to assess the seriousness of the child's situation. The CPS intake tool, 1402, addresses all the requirements for capturing information at intake. All questions in sections 5, and section 7 on the tool shall be asked and documented during intake. The information gathered at the intake form provides the legal basis for CPS to have jurisdiction to be involved. This is important to protect the family's constitutional rights. Other questions in other sections shall be asked and documented, if appropriate, based on the allegations. Just want to take a minute to encourage you not to skimp on questions regarding strengths, and also to ask the questions in different ways to get information. Don't skip the questions regarding what you can do to help. A reporter may end up being a valuable CFT or community resource. That information may help not only in initiation, but also on ongoing aspects of the child welfare case. In addition, information gathered intake can directly impact child well-being outcomes by identifying possible resources for services that may be provided during the assessment and may prevent the need for ongoing services. Be sure to reference the instructions for the intake form. There's valuable prompts and suggestions for completing the intake form, and they provide additional questions for considerations. Nikki, at this time, can you add some of your observations regarding use of the 1402?
Well, I know every time we see new forms and there's more pages added, everybody kind of sighs, but from a working standpoint, I think these are very valuable additions that we've had to this form, to the 1402. If you just follow the questions in the first couple of pages, you're led through identifying whether or not the alleged perpetrator actually meets the legal definition of a caretaker. As intake workers, we're going to hear a lot of information about abused and neglected children, but if those children are not abused or neglected by a parent or caretaker as defined by statute, then it could be that DSS just needs to make a referral to another agency as opposed to conducting an assessment. So it's very important that we identify the role of the alleged perpetrator as a caretaker, and the new tool that we have is very detailed in helping us make those decisions. The new 1402 helps us remember to ask some questions that are easily overlooked in intake, that we forget, and when we get to screening the report, it helps us make better decisions about priority response. So questions about, is the child abandoned versus is the child dependent? This can be the difference between an immediate investigative assessment versus a 72-hour family assessment for the initiation social worker. And the new 1402 leads the intake worker through questions related to human trafficking, which is something that everybody needs to be aware of no matter what area of the state that they're in. So for me, I feel like intake is one of the most valuable skills a social worker can possess, and making the right decisions at this stage sets the tone for everything we do or don't do with a family for the life of the case. And it's very important that you let the tool guide you and you ask good follow-up questions, and this can really help you make good decisions.
Thank you, Nikki. Now I'm going to pass it on to Peter, who's going to talk about the monitoring perspective regarding intake.
Good morning, everyone. Some of you have had the privilege of actually leading monitorings in your county, and hopefully everybody's had the opportunity to go through a monitoring, so some of the things we'll talk about really shouldn't be a surprise. One of the things I do want to say from the outset that we really encourage folks when it comes to the intake piece is, please don't feel like as an intake worker you actually have to work the case, or that you have to decide, is this true or is it not. The purpose of intake is to gather information, and the division has done a really good job of putting some tools in place for us to be able to make those decisions. One of the things I learned really quickly as a line worker especially is that if I have a list of questions in front of me, it prompts me to ask questions that I might not have thought of, or maybe I forgot about. And so I just encourage folks, use those tools. As Nikki said, they can really help. In 2016, we reviewed approximately 1,800 reports. Some of the things that we saw were good, some were not so good, and counties are working on those things. Now, one of the things that we look at is our county screening the reports actually according to policy. And at this point, we're not necessarily talking about the tools that you're using, but we're looking at 4 things. First, does it meet the definition of abuse and neglect? Second, does it meet the caretaker definition according to policy? Is the victim under the age of 18, and is the victim a resident of North Carolina? And so those are the 4 questions we look at when we're asking, was the report screened in according to policy? 93% of what we looked at, yes, they were. And those are screened in reports. And so that's a good thing, and we're pleased with how that's moving along. Okay. Of the screened out reports answering those same questions, as far as answering no to one of those questions so you would be able to screen that out, only 82% of those were screened according to policy. And we're going to talk some more throughout this in the next few minutes about why we see some of those things and how the role that the tools play. One of the things I did want to point out, particularly with screen outs, is that 87% of those screened out reports actually had a written justification. And really what we're looking for, and I know policy is not very clear about doing this specifically, but we really want to see more than just it doesn't meet the definition. You know, it doesn't meet the definition of abuse and neglect. Counties really, it's helpful to you as a county to be able to say, why did we screen this out? Why did it not meet the definition of abuse and neglect? It could be something as simple as Nikki pointed out, it didn't meet the caretaker definition. So you state that in the written justification. It could be that the child was over 18 or lives in another state. But really, primarily what we see missing is that folks are not actually putting in a written justification based on the policy definitions of abuse, neglect, and dependency. And this is one of the areas when it comes to writing this justification that the screening tools can actually help. If you're going through and answering those questions that are on pages like 6 through 15 of the screening tool, if you're answering no to most of those questions, that can actually give you something to put in writing. It did not meet the policy definition for neglect because we said no to this, and this. So here's what we saw as far as those justifications being appropriate. Only 64% of those were appropriate, and we're really encouraging counties, get a little bit more meatier. And when I say meatier, I mean get a little more in depth about what you're saying when you actually do that policy definition. Now I'm going to pass it over, I believe, to Kristy.
Good morning again. Some of you may be wondering where Surry County is. As you can see from the slide, we're one of those counties that border Virginia. You can also see from the slide we're home to Pilot Mountain State Park, an ever-growing wine industry. Perhaps most famously, though, if you're old enough to remember the Andy Griffith Show, you'll recognize Mayberry, which is based on the real-life town of Mount Airy, or city of Mount Airy, which we're lucky to have in our county. Our agency has 115 employees. About 20 of those are child welfare staff. Our current setup, we have 10 Child Protective Services social workers, and 6 of those are investigators and 4 are case managers. All of our CPS social workers rotate intake responsibility and also after hours responsibility. To give you a little bit of perspective about the number of reports we take, last year we took 1,000 CPS reports and we accepted about 600 of those reports for investigation or assessment. Our numbers of reports over the last few years has stayed pretty steady. Haven't seen a huge increase or decrease. We've kind of towed the line. But about a year ago, we started a process of trying to strengthen our Child Protective Services program. One of the first areas we targeted was CPS intake because we recognize that a well-documented CPS report can have a pretty significant impact on a case. And as a result of those efforts, when it came time for our CFSR, we asked our state partners to focus on intake and investigations. Our review was in the summer last year, June of 2016, and we were able to see some of the results of some of the things that we had already put into place as it relates to intake and initiating reports, and the state was able to help us identify some additional ways we could improve. And that's just a little background on how we came to be a part of this webinar today. When we started this process, we recognized we had some issues, and one of the first things that we did internally was to create a human services evaluator position. We created that position specifically to provide quality assurance and targeted training for our staff. And in order to get this position, we had to give up our dedicated intake position. At that point, we began putting all of our CPS social workers on the rotation for intake duties, and we realized pretty quickly that our staff wasn't quite as prepared as we wanted them to be to tackle the intake duties. One thing that became clear very quickly is that as an agency, we'd not done a very good job of sending staff to the state-required trainings. Only a couple of people on our team had even been to the intake training. We also realized that we couldn't just depend on the state to train our staff. We needed some quick hits, so to speak, as far as training went. And so we fell back on some experienced supervisors and social workers to provide just informal in-house training to our group. We pretty much implemented a back-to-basics approach, which included things as simple as making sure that staff had copies of the intake manual and that they were using those copies of the manual every single time they took a report.
Thank you, Kristy. One question that I have is that now that your county shares the responsibility of those intake duties across workers, what's been done to help support them as they're learning this new role?
Well, now we've implemented a plan to help support our staff, and we hope that it cultivates confident intake workers who can conduct adequate interviews and use the tools provided to guide decision making. So as an agency, we have internal quality assurance checks to help review our decision making, and we hold discussion with both intake supervisors and intake social workers when we identify any areas of concern to kind of talk about what we could have improved on and what we could do better in our decision making. We absolutely insist that our intake social workers and supervisors make decisions together for screening reports in, and that they use their tools every single time, because we can't think that we know what policy says. So we have to refer back to the policy every time, whether we've been there for 5 months or 5 years or 15 years. We're just insistent that we refer back to policy and that we're consistent in doing that. And we're very intentional about it at intake, and it's really making a difference in what our screening decisions look like, and they're much improved. And the staff feels much better about what they're doing because of that.
All right, thank you. Now we're going to move on, transitioning to Linda again to talk about appropriate screening during the intake.
Just to kind of back up a little bit, the intake process has 5 steps. Once the structured intake tool has been completed with the reporter, that's step 1, which we've just been talking about, then we move to using the screening tools that Nikki was referring to determine if the reported allegations meet the legal definition of abuse, neglect, and/or dependency, and to aid in achieving consistency in how we regard and how we screen CPS reports. It's important to consult every maltreatment tool that corresponds with any allegation made in the report, even when the report will not be accepted for that reason. Even experienced workers, as Nikki was saying, need to actually consult the decision tree when screening in or out. It's equally important to document when a report is screened out, why it was screened out, which is part of what Peter was referring to earlier. It's not adequate to say the allegation didn't meet the statutory definition of dependency. There has to be more justification regarding why a report was screened out.
Linda, if you could talk a little more about why it's important for even experienced intake workers to make sure that we're using the screening tool.
Sure. Very few people can remember every detail of all the maltreatment screening tools, but most importantly, intake screening tools can be updated over time. For example, the recent addition of the trafficking tools. Upcoming changes may include more screening in regard to substance-exposed infants. In addition, this month I just learned about what are called Sentinel injuries to very young immobile children. These are minor but obvious injuries without a good explanation on an immobile child, and often observed by medical providers, and they have been shown to often be a precursor for more serious injuries at the hand of a caretaker. As more information from the medical community becomes available, the intake screening tools may be revised so that even minor injuries for an immobile child, for some circumstances, may need to be screened in. Lastly, it's important to emphasize how critical it is that all intake workers are consistent in how screening tools are applied. Was that helpful, Crystal?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, continuing on. For screened-in reports, the next step is to determine the county responsible for completing the assessment. Based on record reviews, the OSRI team has identified concerns about the time it takes for a report to transition from one agency to another. It's very important to ensure the intake worker has made a true handoff. The intake worker must assure that the report, in fact, made a transition from one agency to another. Just sending a fax is not adequate. The next step is for the intake social worker to apply the response priority decision tree. The purpose of that priority tree is to determine how quickly the CPS assessment shall be initiated. Use of the priority decision tree ensures consistency in setting response time and that the assessment worker has the appropriate time frame for their initiation. It's important that the assessment worker be able to appropriately plan for their initiation. An incorrect response time of 24 hours versus 72 could limit the assessment worker's time to prepare, but it could also cause the assessment worker to reset their priority away from another assessment that actually had greater risk. Assessment workers can become very frustrated when they rush to respond to a 24-hour report that didn't require that response time. It's better to follow the tools and remember that the assessment worker and/or supervisor can always make the decision to initiate in less than the mandated time frame. Lastly, the screening report is assigned as either an investigative assessment or a family assessment. Just a last comment about timely and appropriate screening of reports affect the CFSR outcomes 1 and 2. Prompt intake and screening of every report is critical. The time to initiate the assessment begins from the point when a reporter first makes contact with the agency regarding allegations. Any delay in gathering intake information and screening the report reduces the time the assessment worker will have to initiate the report. This can directly impact a child's safety. I'm going to hand it back to Peter at this time.
Thank you, Linda. And someone asked the question earlier about policy being updated in regards to the issue around screen-outs being appropriately justified. One of the areas that we're working on at the division with the PIP for the state is policy upgrades, and I have no doubt that that will be part of what we'll be working on. So hopefully at some point we will see some changes in that. Again, in the meantime, we're just encouraging counties, make sure you're very specific about why you were screening that report out. As Linda mentioned, there's lots of tools that are available to you when you're screening, and this is the part, one of the things I love about the new screening tool, the 1402. The old one in the past, it had the section for what tools did you consult in making this policy, in making this decision to screen in or screen out, but it didn't give you a place to put what you actually screened it for. And one of the things that we have seen as monitors, there can be some confusion there. At times, counties tend to think that that box was really there, say this is what we screened it for. What we're looking for at the monitoring piece is when you get all that information from the reporter, you've asked all of those questions, are you referring to the appropriate tools that are necessary based on the allegations? And we've seen some good and we've seen some not so good. As you can see on the screen in front of you, as I said before, one of the things that we saw with reports being screened out was a little bit lower as far as being screened according to policy. And you can see here, of all the reports that we've looked at, about 71% of those screened out reports utilize the appropriate tools. Whereas when you go to the next one right next to it, the reports that were screened in, 86% consulted the appropriate tools. Now again, let me emphasize, this isn't necessarily what you would screen it in for. It just means that as an intake worker and or supervisor, you've looked at that tool, you've answered those questions, does it meet that definition? If you say no, you don't screen it in for that. And I certainly always say to counties, it's never a bad thing to over-consult. It's never a bad thing to look at more tools than you think you might use, because we do see some discrepancies. It's not unusual for us to see confusion between, say, the physical abuse tool and even the improper discipline tool. What does that look like? The questions there are very specific about the types of injury that a child has, the type of where the injury was placed, what was going on at the time, those types of things. If you walk through those, and as you can see when reports are screened out, the physical abuse tool was only consulted appropriately 57% of the time. Whereas on the flip side, those that were screened in, it was consulted 82% of the time. Okay, and you see the other comparisons that we have between emotional abuse, improper supervision, improper remedial care. And again, one of the things that we're seeing as we talk with counties and doing this monitoring is really just a full understanding of what those policy definitions mean and what they actually look like. One example we see a lot, particularly around sexual abuse, a county may get a report that says child-on-child sexual activity taking place. Some counties will go just to the sex abuse tool and screen it out because it doesn't meet the caretaker definition or something of that nature. When appropriately, the best thing to do is also go look at the improper supervision tool to see ask those questions about what the parents may have known. Were the children being left alone? Were they being supervised appropriately? Just to make sure that the right things are being done and those children are safe and that the activity is stopped appropriately. And so a lot of it, as I said, comes down to just understanding the definitions. And we just encourage folks on a regular basis, make sure you just go back and walk through the tool. Even those seasoned intake workers, as we've talked with them, we've done the monitoring, when they've been able to walk through the tool again, those aha moments happen. Maybe they didn't realize that it changed. Maybe they didn't realize something of that nature had been added that was different. And sometimes when we're doing screening, we think we know because we've always answered it that way. Again, that's why the tools can help us be objective when it comes to making sure we make the right decision. And that's why it's so important to gather as much information as you can when you're doing that screening process. Thank you. I'll pass it on to Nikki. Yes, ma'am.
No, we'll let Nikki go ahead from Surry County. That's what I was going to ask next, is really hearing from a county some of the things that they found that they were struggling with and what they have been able to do to address.
Okay. Well, what we found that was happening was just like we've been talking about, is that when we start doing this for a while, what we think we know is the answer. But what we found was that when we've been doing this for a while, over a period of several years, policy changes. So the answer that we think we know is probably not relevant any longer. So in Surry County, we started seeing our workers struggle, and we were struggling to initiate referrals. We were struggling to interview regarding the allegations. We were struggling to plan for safety, and we were struggling to know what a caretaker was, and we were struggling to do things in a timely manner. And when we would get to the point of staffing, we were just struggling to make a case decision. So just overall, our team was struggling, and we wanted to support them and help them from the very beginning to not feel that struggle to get at those decisions. And when we looked a little closer at what we were doing and what we could do better, what we saw was at the very beginning, on day one, we had made the wrong decision at intake, and it had led to confusion about what we were investigating, and our social workers were encountering barriers from the very beginning, and it was because of the decisions that we were making at intake. So that was really the lesson that we took away from our monitoring in regards to intake, was that the struggles that our staff was feeling was because of the decision making that we were having within our agency. And what that kind of brought into light was that no matter how long you've been there, you don't know the answer. Even the best social worker still needs the policy to guide them. So I would just encourage everybody to consult your tools with each and every report, go through the steps, and if you trust that policy, you'll make a good decision throughout the life of your case, or better decisions throughout the life of your case. We have committed to making positive changes in our agency, in training our staff in-house and with the state. We've committed to consult the manual every single time that we get a referral. Sometimes it's hard after you've been doing this for a while not to have a knee-jerk reaction to some types of reports, but we've also committed to the priority response tree and making sure that we can consult that, and we're just committed to the policy. We're committed to trusting in that policy. Our review pointed out to us that we were just not doing a bang-up job that we thought we were, but we're dedicated to conducting quality interviews at intake so that we can make quality screening decisions in Surry County.
All right, thank you to all of us for that first section on CPS intake. So I would like to take a minute to give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you may have on this first information that we covered. We did have one question around policy that Peter was already able to answer. And any additional questions you can type in the chat box. We do have one question from Cindy asking, it says, throughout the state, what is the average time it takes to take a report? And for that one, I would really like to put that back out to you all. I know it's helpful sometimes to know, what that looks like in other counties. So if you guys could type in the chat box, we did have a few people that already answered, and I'll share that while you all are typing in the chat box. One person shared it's 45 minutes to complete the phone call part, and then approximately 20 minutes after that for the research for the follow-up. Someone else, I think the next person was Mecklenburg County, shared it was 25 to 45 minutes for them, and that sometimes the research can even take longer. So it looks like we have quite a few people between 30 and 45 minutes, 25 to 35. So they all seem to be kind of in that time frame. I don't know if anyone else has any information as far as data for that, and if we do, I don't think it would be on the top of their heads, but we can definitely look into that and see if it's something we can include into the follow-up document. A few more people say that it sometimes takes them 45 to 50 minutes or even up to an hour. So I think that gives us a little bit of an idea on some of the differences in timeframes, and I hope that's helpful to hear from other counties kind of what they're experiencing. And if we have any more information, then we can definitely add that into the follow-up document. One other question that we have, can the reporter complete the 1402 and send it to DSS? We've received these situations on conflict reports from other counties. Does one of our presenters here with us have something they could add to that question?
I think as a practice model, you would not want to make that a regular occurrence, primarily because you wouldn't want someone else going out and initiating your assessment. You wouldn't want them asking your questions. Again, because part of what we do as social workers is make sure we're gathering the right information. So the question above that, I think, was tied to that. In what section is it okay to see the attached documentation? If you're getting a police report or something of that nature, I think that's certainly appropriate to add that in the documentation in the narrative section. But I think as far as someone else filling it out and sending it to you, we would not recommend that happening. I'd love to hear from Kristy or Nikki their thoughts on that.
I don't think that I've never encountered that, having somebody that's not another agency filling out a report and screening it in or sending it to us. So I would say if it's another county that's kind of completed the intake and they're sending it to you, that's not unusual. But I would think that somebody that is not another county Department of Social Services would not be completing your 1402 and sending that to you, that would be something that somebody inside your agency would need to go through those steps and need to be completing the 1402.
All right, thank you. So it looks like we have addressed quite a few of the questions, and again, we'll continue to monitor for any additional ones that come up and make sure that we get them out to you. So the next section that we are going to talk about is timely initiation. So Peter, if you could tell us a little about what you're seeing from the monitoring perspective on if we are initiating in a timely manner.
Thank you, Crystal. I'll be glad to talk about that. This is one of my soapboxes consistently that my counties hear me talk about. One of the things we do regularly as a monitoring team is we look at data. We look at all of those legacy reports that you guys have available to you. One of the most popular ones, obviously, is that CYA 004 report. And we get a lot of information there. All of that is gathered from the 5104 that you at the county level enter when you complete that case. It looks at when the report came in, when it was initiated, what the results were, who the reporter was, the type of maltreatment, what was actually found when the case was, and then it's all compiled in that CYA report. Here's one of the things that we began to see consistently as we did monitoring. The December 2016, at the end of December 2016, the final CYA 004 report indicated that counties were reporting that 95% of their reports were initiated within time frame. We began to see as monitors during 2016, as we actually reviewed cases and read through the narrative, actually only 75% of the reports were initiated according to policy. And that's one of the things we'll talk about more about that definition. But one of the key issues that we've seen consistently, that disconnect comes from the understanding of initiation, that not all children are being seen and interviewed. And we've got to be able to put those two together quickly because it's one of the things that the OSRI, the CFSR has shown us is we're not interviewing children timely and able to gather enough information as we can. And again, you heard it said during the intake piece, you know, one of the concerns that I hear consistently from counties, well, what if the child's not in the home? You know, what if they're not there? They've gone to grandma's for the weekend. They're visiting somebody in another state. We understand that. If that can be gathered initiation, you know that up front, do whatever you can to get that case initiated timely. And so one of the things, the responsibility of face-to-face contact is the responsibility of not just the county that receives the report, but we take the idea that it's also a North Carolina responsibility as well. And here's one of the things about initiation where we all really need to work together when it comes to assisting each other, is that if Surry County gets that report and a child happens to be down in New Hanover County spending the weekend at the beach with somebody and it's a 24-hour report, you know, Surry County needs to take the responsibility to send down to New Hanover, would you please go see these children or see this child? Then New Hanover needs to take on the exact same initiative to say, all right, we're going to get this done within 24 hours to the best of our ability. Because not only will it reflect on New Hanover County and Surry County, but more than that, it reflects on North Carolina. And that's one of the things we've all got to realize, that we're in this together, and that everything that we do on the ground every single day, even if it's for another county, it will reflect on the rest of the state. That's one of the things we've not been good at in the last several years, and that's part of the reason we're struggling with this PIP, is to get things together. We need to make sure we're doing it together. So that's part of my soapbox with folks, is help each other out, but make sure you're recognizing that definition of initiation is to see and interview those children. I'm going to turn it over to Linda, let her talk some about the policy definitions about timely initiation.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Just wanted to go back and first start off with a reminder about what the time frames are. Timely initiation, according to, back up, North Carolina General Statute 7B302 says that the county director shall promptly initiate a CPS report of neglect, abuse, and/or dependency. The director shall initiate a CPS assessment of suspected abuse within 24 hours after receiving the report, initiate a CPS assessment of suspected neglect or dependency within 72 hours, and when a report is received and there's a high-risk situation alleged, the county child welfare must make immediate action to see the child, assess the situation, and take whatever action is necessary to protect the child. Intake must use the response trees to assign the time frame. Just a reminder that these time frames are guidelines and indicate the maximum time limit for initiating a CPS assessment. It's important to remember the assessment worker and supervisor can also always make the decision to initiate in less time when deemed appropriate. Timely initiation. I want to build on what Peter was talking about. What constitutes an actual initiation? Again, the General Statute 7B302 states all children living in the home are considered alleged victim children when there's an allegation of any abuse, neglect, or dependency in that home. Therefore, initiation of a CPS assessment includes face-to-face interviews with all children living in the home, whether or not they happen to be in the home when the report comes in. This gets back again to Peter's comment, as indicated previously. Every child that is a resident of that home must be located and interviewed to meet the time frame for initiation. However, I want you to keep in mind that the sequence in which children and parents and primary caretakers are seen at the initiation of a CPS assessment may vary based on the suspected maltreatment. Face-to-face contact and interviews during a CPS assessment shall be conducted in the sequence least likely to cause further risk to the alleged victim, or there should be documentation that reflects the rationale for the sequence followed. DV is a prime example of documenting and using a sequence that is best aimed at keeping a child victim safe. Parents or primary caretakers, their face-to-face interviews with whom that take care of the child, alleged victims, must be conducted the same day that the child's seen. If interviews are not conducted the same day, there must be documentation to reflect the diligent efforts or rationale for delaying. It's important to gain a parent's caretaker's perspective on the allegations to assess safety. Parents and caretakers often have vital information to determining if allegations are true, whether or not they are the alleged perpetrator. The statute also states the assessment and evaluation shall include a visit to the home where a child or juvenile resides. The home where the victim child resides shall be visited during the assessment, or there should be documentation to reflect diligent efforts. It's important to see the children living in the home as soon as possible to assess their living conditions, gain a perspective to level of immediate safety and continuing risk, and determine whether the county agency needs to take further steps. But to reinforce, initiation is the face-to-face interviews with every child within time frame. I just want to talk a little bit more about what is an adequate interview. Initiation of assessment, as I've stated, is a face-to-face interview with the children. The social worker must use effective interviewing strategies and techniques to interview each child based on their developmental level. Documentation shall explain any inability to interview a child. If a child has the capacity for speech, the child must be interviewed. Information gained from these face-to-face interviews must also be documented, and the information used to assess safety and to develop a required safety plan.
Linda, if you could just clarify why we're using the term interview instead of just contact.
Sure. I just want to make sure we're focusing on the intent of the policy here. The CFSR and the state statute requires that during initiation and throughout the life of a case, the County Child Welfare Agency assesses child safety and well-being. To thoroughly assess safety of a child in the home or not in the home, an interview is necessary. During initiation in particular, the social worker must determine if the allegations are true and determine if there are any other concerns of safety or risk. Visual contact is insufficient to gather the information needed. An interview as part of that contact is absolutely necessary. As we've been referring to, I want to make a few comments about diligent efforts. All reports accepted for a CPS assessment, face-to-face interviews shall be conducted with the victim within the time frame, or there shall be documentation of the diligent efforts. Initiation investigation is defined as face-to-face contact. If there's no contact within the time period, the case record should explain why the contact wasn't made, and what steps were taken to assess risk of harm to the child. In addition, parent or caretakers must be contacted the same day, and again, diligent efforts must be documented to reflect attempts to locate and interview the parents, or the rationale for delaying that interview, and why it does not compromise the safety for the child. Diligent efforts are considered throughout the entire review of a case with the OSRI tool. It's important to understand what diligence is. Diligent efforts describe how the child welfare agency engaged the family at every stage of involvement. Every worker should have a plan for diligent efforts ahead of when they need it. We also encourage that during all staffings between supervisors and staff, that the assessment of diligent efforts are brought up at every opportunity. Look at it, take a critical look at, have we really been diligent? Have we made every effort to assess safety and make sure we've contacted everyone that needs to be contacted? These diligent efforts affect all the outcomes on our CFSR.
So Peter, as far as diligent efforts to locate goes for the monitoring team perspective, what would you say that you're seeing from the counties or some of the areas that we're falling short when it comes to diligent efforts?
I think sometimes we see maybe one contact, particularly if the child's out of town or if you can't find someone. One contact is made or one attempt at a contact is made. Sometimes no attempts are there. Sometimes what we want to see especially is just those assists being sent timely. You know, one of the questions that popped up is, are we still held accountable? Technically, yes, but again, our federal partners have asked us also about diligent efforts. What efforts did you make? On page 4 of your 5010, if you're using that document, there's a box there, a grid that says these are the diligent efforts that we made. And so when we're reviewing cases, we go there. How many times did you go by the house? How many times did you make a phone call? Did you also consult other agencies? Did you look at the phone company? Did you look at the power company? Did you check with the school to see if somebody has requested information on this child? A couple of things we've seen in some other counties. Some counties are creating just basic lists. Here's all the places we're going to check within our county. Some have access to software like LexisNexis that will do those searches for you. Sometimes you can just do a Google search and you'll be surprised what may come up about people. We're just wanting to make sure that counties aren't just letting things lie and that they're not actually making some efforts. And so those are the kind of things that we're looking for. One of the things I will say when it comes to actually documenting these diligent efforts, this has been an area of struggle for a lot of counties that we've worked with. The follow-up question that we always ask is, well, first question is, were the children seen and interviewed within time frame? The second question is, if not, were diligent efforts documented? Only 33% of the cases that we looked at last year, if children were not seen and interviewed within time frame, 33% had diligent efforts documented within that record. Okay. Parents and primary caretakers, as you heard Linda talk about, seen and interviewed on the same day only happened 75% of the time, but those that were not, again, diligent efforts were only documented in 43% of those cases. And so we just encourage folks, whether it's a checklist that you create, using the 5010, I'm a big advocate of not reinventing the wheel. You've got a great tool there that prompts you to do certain things as you're working through the life of a case. There's a lot of stuff there that you can use to show the efforts that you're making to contact families, and we just encourage folks to use those things. Safety assessments accurately reflecting the information obtained from interviews, 85% of the time. That's a powerful piece of ensuring safety for children. So a lot of work to be done when it comes to documenting those diligent efforts, but a lot of counties are beginning to make some good progress and headed in the right direction.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to talk a little bit more about timely initiation and the need to conduct a safety assessment during initiation. The North Carolina Safety Assessment, Form 5231, is used to document your safety assessment. Using the North Carolina Safety Assessment tool, the safety issues are identified and the social worker must determine the caregiver's capacity to ensure safety for the children. If a child's not safe or found to be conditionally safe, the social worker should develop the safety response with the parent caregiver and any other safety resource identified to assure safety, or file a petition if needed to ensure safety. The slide here specifically talks about when a safety assessment must be conducted. So when a new report is received and initiated, based on information during your one-to-one and your face-to-face interviews with your children and your caretakers, there are times when I see some questions about how can you assess safety if you haven't seen them in the home. That, of course, is an ideal situation. There may, however, be times when they are on vacation, not in the home, and you may initiate the assessment maybe through an assist where you are interviewing and the children and the caretakers and documenting what you've found and developing your safety assessment prior to seeing the home. That should then be updated, as the next point says, at the time of that initial home visit. Ideally, that would be at the same time, but some cases that is not feasible. Just want to talk a minute about the CFSR again. Safety Outcome 2 ties directly to the identification of appropriate services to protect children in their home to prevent removal. The primary focus is that safety of children was assessed and necessary services were identified. Item 2 under the Safety Outcome 2 is all about child welfare response to the safety situation. Item 3 under Safety Outcome 2 looks at the actual management of risk and safety from initiation and ongoing through the life of the case. The safety assessment is a document that should be utilized often throughout the assessment and modified as needed to reflect the effectiveness of the identified safety interventions. I just want to make a quick comment regarding the use of the CMAPs to assess your social activities, economic situation, environmental issues, mental health needs, activities of daily living, physical health needs, and lastly, summary of strengths. CMAPs provides a format as a general guide to direct your discussion with the family. Every family is unique and each situation is unique. Every element of CMAPs may not be applicable with every family. It's meant as a guide. CMAPs is not required by policy, but policy does require that a full assessment of safety and risk is completed during initiation, and CMAPs just provides a guide to ensure all aspects of a child's environment are adequately assessed. To pass this back to Peter again. Oh, I'm sorry. Not Peter. Nikki.
So Nikki's going to tell us a little about some of what her county experienced and learned from the review in regards to timely initiation.
What we found after our review was that there was a serious disconnect in our timely initiation data. Our report showed that we were consistently initiating reports timely. Our review revealed that we were seeing children and caretakers timely, but we were not conducting thorough interviews timely. What we saw as a direct correlation to seeing people and not interviewing them was kind of a cookie-cutter safety plans as opposed to plans that actually help to strengthen child safety. As child protective social workers, we should not be making social calls. We are out there to assess child abuse, neglect, or dependency, and if we have assessed those allegations, then we should be able to make case decisions. We want social workers to assess risk and ongoing safety of children who remain in their home, or we want them to be able to make case decisions. Since our review, we've placed a great deal of emphasis on what it means to initiate a referral. We're trying to teach our staff that every referral accepted is required to be investigated. The track is the approach to the family. So family assessment or investigative assessment is just how you're going to contact the family. Either of those are going to require an investigation of abuse, neglect, or dependency. This means conducting thorough interviews with everybody in the home, regardless of the allegations in the referral that, if they were true, would constitute abuse, neglect, or dependency as defined by statute. With family assessments, it can be challenging to make sure the children are thoroughly interviewed about all the allegations, and there's also a challenge to be sure in documentation whoever's reading that documentation sort of hears all the voices in the interview, But that's a skill as social workers we just have to work on and try to cultivate and develop. And one of the things we're trying to emphasize and re-emphasize is just that no matter what track the referral is given, your role is to assess child abuse, neglect, or dependency regarding the child or children you're out there to see. You need to be assessing child safety. The track is simply your approach to the family, not the quality of your assessment, and we feel like that is just very important to emphasize. We're trying to make sure that staff know that when referrals are accepted for investigative assessment, we want those interviews to be thoroughly documented with all household members as part of an investigation. Documentation cannot be overemphasized. Our review revealed to us that in many cases we knew that the work was being done, but we weren't giving ourselves credit for all the good things that we knew our staff was doing because we just didn't write it down. I know I'm kind of from the old school of thought that if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So we're trying to implement that back with our staff now. Our supervisors and our staff use county-developed tools for staff in each case. The forms help us make sure policies being followed. We've modified those tools that we had been using to document case staffings at case closure to document social worker and supervisor staffing from day to day from the date that the referral is assigned throughout the case so that we could kind of capture when our social workers were staffing with supervisors, because that's also a step that we were missing in our documentation, was kind of capturing that this is more than just a social worker decision. This was, we were including our supervisors in these decisions, and we were taking this to team staffing, and it wasn't that our workers weren't doing it because they staff a lot. It was just that we weren't very intentional about writing it down or how we were documenting it. So we have taken some steps to kind of put in place some safeguards to help us keep those things in mind and remembering that these are very important steps.
Thank you, Nikki. For our practice implications section, the way we frame this is really looking at some of the common errors to avoid during intake and initiation. So Nikki, if you could tell us about some of those errors and then tips that you all have to avoid them.
Well, some of the common things that we see is screening in reports that we should have screened out, screening out reports that we should have screened in, assigning reports to the wrong track, so giving a more serious report, the family assessment approach, or a report that we probably should have given a family assessment approach to an investigative approach. Poor documentation. So at intake, this would be the intake worker being able to tell you all of this wonderful, beautiful information, and then you're looking at the intake form and there's 2 sentences on there. Going too fast through the intake and just not covering all of the steps. So you could have asked 2 or 3 more follow-up questions and gotten the answers that you needed, but you just skipped over that. Or poor handoff to another agency. So you tried once to call, the line was busy, you didn't try back, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so you just sent the fax. All of those things at intake you can avoid by just following the policy. Just follow the tools, let the tools guide you. Take your time, use good interview skills, use your scaling questions. Don't interrogate a reporter, but just conduct a professional interview and get all of the information and ask those good follow-up questions. And remember that it's very important when giving a report to another agency that you make sure you talk to a person and that they accept the report. They know that they're getting that report. As far as the initiation, a lot of the common errors that we found were just efforts to locate or engage. So the diligent efforts were just not sufficient. Seeing but not interviewing, and poor documentation. Again, ways to avoid those common errors would be to follow the policy. When you make diligent efforts, you are kind of digging folks up. You've got your investigator hat on, and you are without ceasing looking for those folks so that you can document every step of that. That way, if somebody comes back and says, "Why didn't you see these folks?" you can just hand them a piece of paper and say, "Here's all the steps I took to try to see them on time." Understanding that contact is interviewing. Child safety is related to good, sufficient interviews. If you go out and see somebody, but you've not asked them about the allegations, it is very difficult to have a good, strong safety plan in place because you don't really know what you're planning for if you've not conducted a good interview. And documentation. I would say to document everything. And that could help you avoid a lot of these common errors. And Kristy is going to tell us about
some of the ways that we've been able to address the issue of avoiding common errors is going back to using the manuals and the forms and our tools very consistently and very deliberately. I think that we have to recognize that if we follow those steps at intake and initiation and document what we've done, we'll make better decisions and have stronger plans for safety with kids and families throughout the life of the case. I think we also, and we've struggled with this some in Surry County, we have to acknowledge that while we might not always like what the policy tells us, we may disagree with it for whatever reason, but we have to just stick to that policy, and we have to follow it as closely as we can. I tell our social workers all the time that you have to trust the process, and you trust the process because it works. When I was a line supervisor for Child Protective Services, sometimes social workers would come to my office after they had hung up with a reporter, and they wouldn't have written the report down on a report form. And as a supervisor, you have to, stop that and say, you've got to follow the process. You have to trust the process. Our process works. It's evidence-based. It's proven. When we trust that process and when we follow policy, then good outcomes typically follow. The other thing that I think we've struggled with in Surry County, and we're slowly overcoming it, is our documentation of supervisory oversight. Our social workers were talking to their supervisors all the time about initiating, about intake, about investigations, but when we had our monitoring last summer, we realized that they weren't documenting, that they were discussing that case with their supervisor, and they weren't kind of mapping out what the next steps were for a case. The other thing I would stress is don't skimp on training. It's easy, I think, sometimes to let training slide when you're short-staffed or if you've got a lot going on, if it's a particularly busy time in investigations or what have you. It's easy, I think, to let training slide and plan to catch it up later, and I would encourage you, and we're having to take this advice ourselves. We're having to buckle down and just make sure we send people to training. The other thing I'd point out is a second-party review system. We've implemented a very robust second-party review system, and I won't sugarcoat it. Our supervisors review 100% of CPS cases prior to that case being staffed with a team. And when I say review, I mean they read the record cover to cover and use a monitoring tool and go back and forth with the worker to make sure that the case is documented thoroughly and that all the steps for a good investigation have taken place. It's a huge time commitment for our staff and for our managers, and sometimes I'm even pulled in to read cases before staffing, but that has probably been one of the biggest helps to us to identify where our problem areas were. And the final comment that I'd like to make about avoiding common errors is that when we had our review last year in June with the state, when our state partners began the process of conducting the review with us, they asked us where we thought our needs were, and we identified fairly quickly that we thought our needs were in intake and initiation for CPS reports. So when the state came to do our monitoring, that's the area we focused on. The state recognized the efforts that we had already put into place, and those were noted in our program evaluation, and then they helped us problem solve some of the areas that needed additional attention. I've been with social services for 23 years and have been involved in a lot of audits around child welfare. I mean, I go back to the old biennial days, and what I will tell you is this has been the most meaningful process and program evaluation that I've been a part of. It was a true learning experience for us, and I think that we've made significant improvements in our work because of it.
Thank you for all the information on the practice implications. I think it's always really helpful to hear from the counties, their experiences, and so oftentimes our attendees of the webinar really enjoy having that perspective. So thank you for sharing all that information. We're actually going to take some of Kristy's advice and use our program monitor and DSS partners to help us answer some of these questions that have come in. So thinking Peter can help us with a few of these. We have a few that are around the idea of if the child is in another state.
Yeah, and one of the folks I noticed that kind of answered that question for you. I mean, yes, the initiation is up to the county that accepts the report where the county of residence for that child is. But as I said before, the attempts at the initiation need to be documented. The diligent efforts need to be documented. Those types of things. That way, you won't be, to go back to the old biennial days, you won't be dinged for something if you have made diligent efforts to get in touch with that child, to conduct that interview. Then yes, that will be okay. One of the other questions I saw about the official initiation date, you said for whatever reason the child is interviewed on a different date outside of the time frame. I'm assuming the official initiation date would be the date the last child is interviewed, correct? Yes, 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 yes. That is the date you want to put on that 5104. And when I look at that CY004, and if I see counties that have an annual average of about 98%, that's not realistic. I mean, it's really not. When you think about all of the different things that can happen when it comes to initiating and seeing all of the children timely, so just make sure you put the date of that. And usually around 92 or 93% is a little bit more realistic. And so yes, that is the official date you want to enter onto the 5104. Crystal, was there another one you wanted me to look at?
We have one. What is the requirement for seeing children that visit in the home?
We run into this one quite a bit too, and Linda, you might have to speak up and help me with some of this, because particularly if you have children that, say dad has children that primarily reside with mom, but they come in to visit. I think we consider those to be those 7-day contacts, those collateral children. Since they're not in the home, they're not technically victim children. And so if they're visiting there regularly, yes, you want to make contact with them. But if they're not if that's not their primary residence, then they become collateral ones that you would want to talk to. Now, the thing to consider is if they are visiting in dad's home when the incident happens, then yes, they would be considered victim children. So you do have to see them timely as well. All right, so just make sure that's very clear with your intake. It goes back to that thorough intake. Who's actually present, if you can get that information, who is actually present when the actual event took place. Okay.
And that's exactly what I was going to say in support of Peter's response, was you really have to take it on a case-by-case basis. And who was in the home when the alleged allegations occurred, and is the parent the caretaker for that child? Because this could apply to children that are in a home where they live with mom or dad part-time back and forth, or it could be other visiting children. And it really have to look at the case-by-case scenario, and do they fit the definition of an alleged victim.
And Crystal, let me point out too, I think one of the, and we've neglected to say them today, but one of the best state partners that counties have, I mean, I appreciate the props from Surry for the work that we've been able to do with them, but on a day-to-day basis, if you have questions about screening out, and if it's justified to do so, if you have a question about who is a victim child and who you need to see, please call your CPR. Right? That's one of their primary roles. They are available to you. they're not necessarily going to give you the answer, but they'll walk you through, they'll help you understand policy. Please get in touch with one of those folks first to answer some of those things.
Thanks for sharing that important resource that I think sometimes is often not used as much as it could be. So we've been able to answer quite a few of the questions that you all have had. In the interest of time, what we'll do with the remaining questions, we have captured all of them, and we'll make sure that we get the answers to you on the follow-up document. So even though we haven't been able to get to all of the questions and answers today, we will get them to you so that you all make sure that you have all the information that you need. So as they come in, we'll continue to capture the questions and document them. So one of the last things we want to do, talking about the impact of this information on you and your agency, we like for you guys to spend a few minutes talking about one thing that you'll do in response to what you've learned today. So if you could type into the chat box really something that stood out that you want to go ahead and apply. And this is really going to help with that transfer of learning, so that we make sure that this information isn't something that we just have in the back of our brains. We want to make sure it's something that we're using and we can really apply the information that we've learned today. So as some of the answers come in, I'll just talk about a few of them. We have someone that said document everything. I think that was one of the points that was definitely hit home in quite a few different sections of our webinar today. And also we have diligent efforts documenting, so that's one of the pieces that we touch on where documentation is important, but talking a little about diligent efforts. Consulting the tools each time. This was a really helpful bit of information that was suggested, that no matter how long you've been here, whether it's 2 months, 2 years, 20 years, is that really making sure that we're referring back to those tools. It's going to be very helpful. We're not going to remember everything that's on all of them, so that was a really good piece of information that I'm glad someone's taking back with them. Continuing to consult policy and have a secondary reviewer when needed. So there's lots of good things that you all have identified for something that you'll take away from today. And so I think we've been able to get you hopefully some good information. So I do want to say thank you again to the presenters. We have the contact information for the presenters on the screen here so that you all can contact them as you wish. And I'll give you a minute in case you are capturing someone's email address. And then you also have these slides on the handouts for this webinar, so if you weren't able to get down the contact information for someone, or if you want the information following today, you do have that on the handouts. The slides are included with them.